I want to bring an update to you on a story that we began the program with regarding that shooting at the high school in Broward County, Florida. Sadly, the numbers are not good. Multiple reports now have it that at least 15 people, most likely largely students, were killed. The sheriff says the suspect, a former student named Nicholas Cruz, he is now in police custody. We'll continue to update the story for you. I want to bring in my panel. On Wednesday nights, we get into legal topics here. Jim Kousouros, criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, and a former prosecutor in his own right. Mayo Bartlett, a partner in Mayo Bartlett PLC, and also a former prosecutor as well, and former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit in Westchester DA's office. We'll get into legal topics in a second, but all three of us are parents. We've all had kids either in high school, like you and me, Mayo, or ones that went through it, and you see the pictures, and you see kids running out the door, and you see, for good reason, law enforcement with body armor and assault gear like it's a battlefield. And it's a different date line, it's a different school, it's a different person, but it's the same narrative. And I'm frankly, you know, not that you're ever inured to this thing here, but it's so unbelievably common lately. It's just, it's numbing, you know? It really is. And I don't know what more we can say that we haven't said in the past, but it's, I don't know, Mayo, it's just, it is shocking that this has become almost normal.
Well, our popular culture now lends itself to these things. You have divisiveness that we've never had before in terms of political persuasion, but everything else in life. Any difference that ever exists, we find a way to magnify and amplify that. And just again, you look, if you flip through the 800 channels on TV and try to find something that you can sit through with your children, you find very limited things. If you listen to music, you find very few stations where it's not explicit, and forget the fact that it's explicit, but where the theme is not basically hurting somebody in some form. And that's across the board. And we accept that in politics, we accept that everywhere. And the fact that you have guns readily available may make it a bit easier, but I don't know that that's necessarily the primary reason that it happens, because now you see people using automobiles, you see kids beating each other and videotaping it, posting it, and they're emulating largely the parents. And as Jim and I were talking earlier, you know, I think that our responsibility generationally, forget about, you know, what political persuasion you are, has not been met. So we're really not leaving the generations that are following us with anything near what we had when we were their age.
You know, look, I'm speechless. You know, I agree, of course, with everything that you've said, but when did it happen that so many young kids are crossing the line and actually taking a gun in their hands and mowing down their fellow students? You know, you can watch the videos, you can, I don't know, fantasize about it, but it takes a lot to put a gun in your hand and start shooting people. What has happened that line can be crossed so often?
And just when we were, I mean, listen, I don't know all the facts. They'll emerge. The numbers even might tragically change, obviously, an increase. We'll know more about the shooter, I'm sure, as the night progresses here in the days ahead. We'll know how he got his hands on the gun and all the rest. But to bring it back, guys, 20 years ago, kids didn't get their hands on guns. And I'll get into that tomorrow, okay? But I sat at this very table the night of Sandy Hook, and I said, this is a turning point. And I was so wrong. Virginia Tech, I can go chapter and verse. We've had it in suburbs, we've had it in rural areas, we've had it in inner cities, and it's just the date line changes. We've had it in churches, we've had it in bars, we've had it in every single malls and courts, wherever. And you know, we average more than a mass shooting every day in this country.
Well, people had guns. Kids had their hands on guns. You had gangs. You had all the things we have. What you didn't have was people willing to walk into places and kill people that they didn't know. So nobody would do that in the past. It would have been personal, some connection. It probably didn't make any sense, but there was some connection. Now there's a willingness to take out whatever's going on in your life on people who you don't know at all. If you go back to what happened in Dallas, it was against police officers who had nothing to do with what actually had happened, I think, in Minnesota. You have people who go into movie theaters and they shoot everybody in the theater. They don't even know the people in the theater.
But you know what's happened? The door to that type of behavior was never opened. And once it happens once, that door is open and somehow it becomes possible, it becomes doable, and so people copy it and just go in and what seemingly was impossible to occur or just unfathomable is just no longer unfathomable. And there are people in this country, kids in this country, that will do these things.
You know, like I said, we're going to know more of the
So
facts of this,
tragic.
but it's just, you know, right before the show, I happened to call one of my kids actually went to camp with plural students at that very high school and stuff. And then when you put it through the guise of, imagine the kids, or imagine one of us was going tonight to try and collect our kid, and we don't know, you know, I heard it from so many parents today that were on the scene. It's different until it's your town. It's different until it's your kid. It's different until it's that school.
Of course.
And then.
Of course.
Anyway, we've got a bunch of legal issues we want to get into. We'll get into that on the other side of the break here. I just wanted to bring you the latest out of yet another tragic shooting in America. Stay with us. And welcome back. Let's get into some legal issues. And this one has to deal with the president, but it's not the Russia probe. In fact, it's Stormy Daniels. Yes, Stormy Daniels. Back in the news last month, the Wall Street Journal reported that the porn star was paid $130,000 in hush money to keep quiet about an affair with Donald Trump. Well, the check was reportedly cut a month before Election Day. Coincidence, you may ask? Well, the affair happened about a decade earlier, coincidentally right after Melania had Barron. I digress, though. But now we know where the money came from. Michael Cohen. You may remember him. He's an attorney at the Trump Organization and a pretty prominent one. He just said he paid that $130,000 out of his own pocket. Here's what Cohen told the New York Times, quote, "Neither the Trump Organization nor the Trump campaign was a party to the transaction, and neither reimbursed me for the payment, either directly or indirectly. The payment was lawful and was not a campaign contribution or a campaign expenditure by anyone," end quote. Now, Stormy's manager says Cohen's comments could invalidate that gag order and allow her to tell her story. Cha-ching. That all surfaced in response to a complaint filed by a government watchdog group to the Federal Election Commission. Now, it's also raising questions about whether any laws were broken here. And, you know, Common Cause filed this report. But let's dispense here with the insanity. Michael Cohen, just out of the goodness out of his heart, for no possible reason, wrote a check for $130,000. Now, I know you two are really nice
offended
guys.
that you don't think a lawyer could be a
How
nice...
many clients have you guys written six-figure checks for just because?
This week?
Yes, exactly. Well, specifically, guys,
It's only Wednesday.
in terms of a violation, people should remember the name John Edwards, okay? And remember the then presidential candidate and keeping quiet an affair that he was having as well here. It got him indicted, okay? Now, more than that, there's a question as to whether or not the check that he cut to Daniels, or to a real name Clifford, if you want to get technical, was an unreported in-kind contribution for the Trump campaign or an unreported expenditure by the campaign. Because if the money was to keep her quiet, then that is a campaign contribution. That has to deal with a campaign. And whether or not he says he did it out of the goodness of his heart, that's where there's a question right now, and that's really, if you tie it back to Edwards as well, did he use funds in effect here. And was he ever reimbursed by Trump? I doubt that he ever wrote the check just because.
I think the big problem is that, it's too complicated in terms of campaign finance. You ought to be able to report that on a postcard, and that way you don't have to get into all these details. But I think that there's a school of thought that says that if it's on behalf of the campaign and it's for political purposes, it's in furtherance of the campaign. And again, it's interesting that it's 10 years ago and it happens right before the campaign. Right before the election, that it could actually end up being a violation of campaign.
Because 1971, in campaign election law, in the Election Campaign Act of 1971, they said that a secret payment is equatable to a campaign contribution.
As long as it satisfies the elements and the factual elements that that Mayo refers to. This is one of those looks like it, smells like it, and how far does it go? I mean, look.
Does the Bar Association say anything about this as an attorney to do this? Are we crossing ethical lines here, forgetting for the moment legal?
You very well may be. I mean, it is a very suspicious payment for a lawyer to do it on behalf of a client, claim that it's not a campaign contribution, it was not related to the campaign, but obviously it was intended to protect his reputation, very conveniently right before the election. From a circumstantial standpoint, if you look at this, it is hard to imagine it not being in furtherance of the campaign. And to say he has not been compensated indirectly, he's still the lawyer. I'm sure he's still getting paid. I'm sure he's not going anywhere. And I'm sure he's making a good amount of money doing
Now let's get to the second point of this. The manager of Stormy Daniels says, hey, he talked about the check. We basically had an NDA here. We had an agreement here that we weren't going to talk about this. All of a sudden, he put this in public purview. Game over. I'm going to start going to the highest bidder. Just wait till I talk. I have a story to tell or an interview to sell. So, does he have a point?
He has a great point. And on top of that, in the realm of reality, you stop and look at even if even if he hasn't breached the confidentiality agreement, what's the remedy for Donald Trump? So let's assume she goes out and she says this is what happened. Okay, he can sue her. When you sue her, you open yourself up to even more discovery. So the $130,000, which seems like a pretty small amount actually when what we're talking about is of such magnitude, really probably won't make that much of a difference to her. Secondly, she's now much more marketable. She'll be able to go out there and make a lot of money selling books and doing interviews. But I do think that when you start to talk about the amount of money and the fact that that was a particular number, specific number, there's a good chance that they did breach the agreement.
Well, you have to look at the agreement as well. I mean, I'm not so sure that that's the case. I mean, the story was out there. The fact that she got paid was out there. I don't know.
And she did an interview in Touch magazine back in 2011 that referenced some of this, but nonetheless, the agreement, as we said, in October of 16, they write up the papers. So you're right, we got to see the language of it. But if it was that both parties agreed to not discuss, period, and he's basically giving factual statements that he gave her $130,000 himself, we shall see. Okay. We're going to jump to a quick commercial break, but when we come back, if you haven't seen this video, you really have to. Police department in Tennessee facing a $10 million lawsuit. That after the sheriff caught on tape saying, shoot a suspect to protect the police cars. And we're going to get into the whole issue about chasing stolen cars here as police policy as well, but you got to see the story to believe it. Stay with us. Next on the docket, a fatal police shooting in Tennessee, and it has spurred a $10 million lawsuit. Now, this all started when the suspect, a man named Michael Dial, led police on a two-county car chase over a suspended license. Now, here's the dash cam video. It captured it all. 3 officers were injured. Police wound up shooting and killing the suspect, and the widow is suing, saying the cops killed her husband just to prevent damage to police cars. Now, before you consider this a frivolous suit, listen to how the county sheriff described what happened.
I told him, I said, take him out.
I heard.
Damn, I don't give a shit.
It wasn't long after that I heard shots fired.
They said, we'll ram him. I said, don't ram him, shoot him. F that shit. They gonna tear my cars up. They don't think I'll give the damn water to kill that mother. They full of take him out. I'm here on the damn end, wrong end of the damn county there. I love this. God, I tell you what, I thrive on it.
Okay, and let me do the disqualifier, or the qualifier here. In no way is this guy representative of all police. I think this is like almost out of a bad sitcom. You would see something like this here, okay? Nonetheless, first off, there's a broader debate. I've had this for years. For a car, I understand it. You don't want to ever look the other way when a crime's committed. But between the prevalence of choppers right now, the ability to trace cars and everything else, do we want to really risk our law enforcement and have lunatics like the guy who led that 2-county charge to risk killing civilians too?
That's right. It's
for a
not only
vehicle?
it's not only the officers.
Is the risk worth the reward? I don't see it.
That's why most departments, in
right.
fact, every department I'm aware of has a policy that you don't engage in high-speed chases. In particular, you radio ahead. There are a number of things you can do. You can set up roadblocks, and chances are, most of the people that end up getting killed like this didn't necessarily need to get killed. So the guy may have been able to be taken into custody. But the fact that you have the leadership expressing the views that were expressed and the laughter and the joking at somebody who was shot and killed is the most troubling part, because that person leads from the top and everybody else is getting their cue from him. And I'm quite sure within that department you probably have rookies that wouldn't have said that, who may have gone on in a couple of years to be much better.
To your point, when there was afterwards the announcement in the press conference, there was a clearly shaken deputy that pulled the trigger, and then you see his chief, who was there on the screen, showing not a scintilla of contrition about it. So clearly, it wasn't universally felt that this was no big deal, or that he loved it, and all the rest. Again, one bad actor is not indicative of everything else, but Jimmy, these guys got body cams on. They know their conversations are recorded as law enforcement every day. And to say that, not only did you do it, but you loved it, and, it's not worth damaging a squad car over this,
He thrives on this. That's what he says.
And the guy, let me be clear, the guy driving the vehicle, stolen vehicle, would have deserved whatever punishment if we capture it, because he endangered life, the welfare of so many. I'm not minimizing that there was a crime that they were pursuing, and a legitimate one. However, that's not the messaging anybody teaches you at the academy.
15 minutes ago, we spoke about a tragedy where a kid got a gun and was predisposed to shoot people. You just heard an officer with a badge who's allowed to have a gun telling you he thrives on it. I mean, there are people that do thrive on that. Look, he had a suspended license. You don't need to chase him. Most departments don't permit the chase. Radio ahead, stop the guy, put him in cuffs, and then he gets either probation or it's not like the crime of the century. This was fun.
Well, it was fun for the guy that wasn't there. It was fun for the guy that was sitting back in an office who is directing these officers to shoot. They may not have shot, but for the order coming from the chief.
He's directing them to murder somebody. Yeah. I mean, there's really no... And saying that he loves it. I don't know what to tell you.
And now, I mean, look, these guys, they're going to live with that forever. This man's dead. The harm that they've done to law enforcement across the board, you can't even measure. Because people who would never have done that now are going to be judged based upon what this guy did.
In these civil suits, like the one that we have in front of us, is the standard, obviously not in a criminal case, but in a civil case, is the standard still weighed heavily in the favor of law enforcement, that it's a discretionary decision as to what force to use here or not?
Oh, it is, absolutely, because you're looking at what a reasonable officer under similar circumstances would do. So the question, unfortunately, in my opinion, has been that you tend to look at these shootings, and quite often the shooter himself or herself is not necessarily the bad actor. It's a supervisor who fails to take proper command of the situation. And if that person doesn't do their job, then everything can fall apart very quickly. And quite often the shooter's the one who ends up being blamed, but they're put in a position where they end up having to shoot.
And would you be surprised, one way or the other, that the police, that the $10 million suit won't be awarded to the plaintiffs?
Well, you know, it depends on the municipality. Now, there are a lot of municipalities, not necessarily in the Northeast and not necessarily in blue states, that look at behaviors such as this and they reach out to the family. They actually show a tremendous amount of humanity. They actually charge officers where appropriate, and they settle cases civilly, and you don't have to necessarily go to trial on each and every case. So they look at these cases.
There's
and
no, you know, racial issues here. That, I mean, I would be stunned, you know, that the citizens of this municipality who have kids, who may have a suspended license, who may get scared and run away, would get a bullet between their eyes.
But Jim, that's
that would
part
be
of the problem
so
also. That's part of why we're
disappointing.
dealing with what's happening in Florida, the fact that we don't see each other. If you look different than I do, you know, I just move on to something else, as opposed to saying, hey, it shouldn't matter who that kid was.
No,
you know?
you understand what I'm saying.
I know what
that,
you're saying.
You know, there are some issues, and we've covered
Absolutely,
them. You know,
Issues
but
of race
we as a
issues of
nation,
race,
we as
yeah.
a nation don't tend to see each other
That's
as
right.
we would want to be seen. Put it
That's
that
right.
way.
No, I completely agree with you. But I mean, just regardless of what the kid looks like or doesn't look like, it would stun me for these cops to get away with it. And I'd like to know why a criminal prosecution isn't being considered as well.
Against whom, though?
Yeah.
Because the prosecution should probably be against the person giving the order.
And there are no criminal charges filed as of yet in this particular case. And I always say, in these things, the ones you should champion most of all for there to be some punishment should be law enforcement, because the vast majority would never even consider
Absolutely.
saying or doing anything like
Absolutely.
this, and they don't want to be tarred with the same charges, or at least stain. Guys, great job as always. Thank you very much. When we come back, we're gonna.